Okay, the Thursday, October 18th, 2018 meeting of the Falmouth Water Quality Management Committee will come to order. First item on the agenda is an experiment of sorts. Suffolk County on Long Island, New York is geologically very similar to Cape Cod, and population and development of there is much denser than Cape Cod, but we have similar water quality issues with our estuaries. We're joined today via the miracles of teleconferencing by Ken Ziegel, who is the Associate Public Health Engineer of Suffolk County. And he's going to sort of share with us what Suffolk County has been doing along the lines of what we have been doing as far as trying to protect the estuaries and find ways of doing it economically and without sewering everything. So we have him on a telephone line, and we have a slideshow which Eric is going to...
He's going to run it.
Master. Okay, he's going to run it from Long Island. All right, Ken, welcome. Good. That's the...
Let me just try one more.
So if it's all right with you to just talk it through and let me know when you want to advance a slide, maybe we can do that. Because we got your presentation.
Set, Eric, now.
Okay, now try advancing.
All right, that's fine. That's fine.
You tell Eric when to advance, and we'll be going.
Okay, so basically, I was on slide 2.
Yep.
And so we'll keep going. So I mentioned before we got 360,000 conventional systems and/or cesspools. Conventional system in Suffolk County is just a septic tank followed by a leaching pool. And I think we take the lead in terms of number of these kind of antiquated disposal technologies countywide. 74% of the county is unsewered, unlike our counterparts in Nassau County, where quite a bit of the county is sewered. And I'm not sure if this is similar to you guys, but in addition to causing surface water problems, which we'll talk about in a minute, we sit on top of sole source aquifer. All of our drinking water essentially comes from public supply wells and/or private supply wells. And nitrogen in public supply wells are pretty deep. Generally hasn't been a huge concern because they're hundreds of feet deep, but there's definitely been issues with some of the private supply wells, especially in highly developed areas and areas out east where there's a lot of farms. And so we have 3 major estuary systems in the county. Long Island Sound study, Long Island Sound you guys are probably familiar with, Peconic Estuary and South Shore Estuary Reserve. All of them are significantly impaired one way or another with nitrogen. We have what we called a harmful algal bloom symposium, and basically developed a harmful algal bloom action plan with consisting of a bunch of guided with a bunch of different national experts on algal blooms, and initial findings of. Sorry guys, I gotta remember to tell you which slide. I'm on slide 4 right now. So initial findings and kind of feedback from the expert work panel was that Suffolk County, the number and diversity of the algal blooms that they've seen here, initially in their opinions, were unprecedented elsewhere in the country, and they're impacting human health, shellfish populations. They're ultimately causing the chlorine reduced water clarity has devastated our eelgrass populations, which is ultimately also tied to coastal resiliency and protecting against storm surges. You can see our local shellfish populations from its peak back in the 70s has been basically decimated to almost nothing. Next slide. Slide 5. This is one of the outputs of the subwatersheds wastewater plan that I mentioned. This is our planning study. It's a science-based study. We're using a groundwater model to estimate the predicted concentrations in groundwater and not only the predicted concentrations, but also the allocation of nitrogen by major nitrogen source. And so this is an example of the Great South Bay. This is one of the hardest hit areas in Suffolk County. Very high residence time for the surface water body and very densely populated. And so DEC's drinking water standard, which is way higher than, as most folks know, than the ecological standard is 10 milligrams per liter. And the areas on this map basically show significant areas that are actually predicted to be above DEC's drinking water standard, and a lot of areas that are pretty close there too. And generally, for most unsewered areas in the county, on-site wastewater makes up about 70% of the nitrogen loads that we're seeing that are reaching our surface water bodies. Let's go to the next slide, the county wastewater approach, and then you can actually skip on to the slide after that, which is slide 7. And so the general approach that the county has taken is kind of this three-pronged approach. One are these innovative alternative on-site septic systems. Two would be this concept of neighborhood clustering. It could be using, could be as little as 2 homes connected to one innovative alternative on-site systems, or 100 homes connected to one. Basically, areas would be focused in areas that, for whatever reason, on-site individual systems couldn't be used, but sewering was too expensive. In general, most of the studies that have been done on Long Island for sewer feasibility studies, sewering is just very cost prohibitive down here in Suffolk County. Connection estimated per household connection costs, I think, range from upwards of, in a lot of different studies in most areas, $50,000 to over $100,000 per household. So sewering for most areas is just not feasible, and that's why one of our main focus is now looking at these innovative alternative on-site systems. Next slide, slide 8. And is everyone there familiar with these innovative on-site systems?
Yes.
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 What they are? Okay.
You can feed forward.
Okay. And so the general approach for most areas in Suffolk County is that we're going to use these systems, but we have to shift the paradigm. The industry, the public, the county, everybody's been focused in it and are comfortable with these conventional systems that we've been using for the last 40, 50 years. And so it's a big shift to go from the use of concrete blocks and basically leaching pools to these systems that now require more careful design, maintenance to make sure that they're performing properly. And so the county's taken this basically this 5-step approach. Parallel tracks. One track is the first thing that we want to do is demonstrate that these systems, we know that they work in other jurisdictions throughout the country, but we wanted to prove that they work here. And so we have a pilot program, a demonstration program that's out there, basically to demonstrate that these systems work before we take the leap of faith and attempting to convert everybody to these systems. We also need to prepare the industry. They need to be trained on how to design the systems, how to operate the systems, how to maintain the systems, how to install the systems properly. So we have a separate parallel track for that. We also, if we're going to shift over to installing these systems, we want to make sure that they perform properly. So we needed to and ultimately establish what we're calling a responsible management entity. That ended up being Suffolk County Department of Health Services, Office of Wastewater Management. And so what we're calling Article 19 of the Sanitary Code, which was recently enacted, that enabled the use of these innovative alternative systems in Suffolk County, but it also required the establishment of a RMA to oversee ensure that they were installed, constructed, and maintained properly. If we're going to extend these throughout use in Suffolk County and ultimately attempt to attack the nitrogen problem countywide, then we're going to require certain sanitary code amendments to facilitate how and when these are going to be installed. And last but not least, I mentioned this before, in order to get public, local official buy-in and ultimately develop the most cost-effective strategy to implement something on a countywide basis, we need to develop a roadmap or a planning study, which is the subwatersheds wastewater plan that I'll talk about in a little bit. Next slide. You can actually go to slide 10, which is the septic demonstration program. And so we've completed 2 phases of this demonstration program. This mostly was focused on residential properties. To date, basically what happened was we reached out to vendors, and asked them if they wanted to participate in the program. If they participated in the program, they would have to donate a certain amount of systems to the county for demonstration in the county. But if they did donate and they performed properly, they are given, quote unquote, an expedited approval process to get use for what we call provisional use in Suffolk County, which is an advantage to them in terms of the marketplace and getting their foot in the door. So we ended up with total of 39 installations between the 2 different phases of the demonstration program. Overall, it's been very successful, and for the most part, which we'll talk about in a little bit, things have gone pretty smoothly, and everybody's happy. We also have, you can go on to the next slide, slide 11, a batch of commercial demonstration projects. A few of these are focusing on more experimental, I don't want to say experimental technologies, but alternate technologies such as wetland projects, and then also installation of larger innovative alternative systems at some of our county parks. So next slide, slide 12. Through the septic demonstration program, or the innovative alternative demonstration program, we've approved a total of 6 technologies for use as provisional use in Suffolk County. And ultimately, in order for a system to get provisional use approval in Suffolk County, they had to meet an average concentration of 19 milligrams per liter for 6 months. That was the threshold that we established. Our influent concentrations into the systems, we estimate roughly 65 milligrams per liter or higher. And so we're generally seeing, to meet this 19, about over a 70% reduction in nitrogen for the systems that are performing properly. And you can take a look at that, some of the preliminary results on the next slide, slide 13. That's just a quick overview of the demonstration program that we had to get the ball rolling, so to speak, with some of these technologies, prove they work in the county, and also facilitate the more general use of the systems. Now, provisional use does not allow them to install an infinite number of systems in a county. There's kind of 3 stages. There's the pilot stage or the demo stage, which is the first stage of use in the county. Then there's provisional use stage in the county. I don't have the requirements off the top of my head, but even under provisional use, they're only allowed to install a certain number of systems in a county. And those systems, it's kind of like an expanded demonstration program. Those systems still have to be sampled less frequently, but they still have to meet the 19 milligrams per liter. Once they meet that second tier of sampling requirement, then they can go to general use in the county. They can be installed as many systems as the manufacturer would like. Okay, let's move on to preparing the industry, and I'm going to talk quickly about the training program. So I think you can move on to slide 15. And so basically what the county did, we've hired, I'm not so sure if some of the folks up there are familiar with Justin Jobin at all, but he came from Rhode Island. I can't remember exactly which jurisdiction in Rhode Island, but he's an expert in these systems. He's been through this, been through the millwork, and he's done a lot of the hands-on building of these programs for both the demonstration program as well as what we're talking about now, the training program. And so this training program is definitely a key element in order to prepare the industry. And so they've worked with the local liquid license agencies, consumer affairs to develop what they're calling endorsements under the liquid waste umbrella. And in order to get these endorsements, in order to install and maintain systems in these innovative alternative systems in Suffolk County, they have to get these endorsements in order to qualify. In order to get the endorsements, they have to take and get certified for these innovative alternative systems training classes, and they also have to maintain their certification through periodic updates for license renewal. And so the county is working in cooperation with New England On-Site Wastewater Training Program. Been very successful to date. This slide's a little outdated. I think they're up to maybe even 20 classes to this point right now, and they've had, I think, well over 500 industry participants. So they've received a lot of interest. It's a lot of work for them. I know that for a fact. Coordinating, performing, and then tracking all this information. But so far, it's been pretty successful. So let's move on to code amendments, and quickly let's talk about the responsible management entity. And so I've already mentioned this before, but the first major milestone for code amendments was enacting this Article 19, which basically permitted the use of the innovative alternative systems in the county, established a responsible management entity, and ultimately ensured that these systems are going to be designed, installed, and properly maintained in Suffolk County. And the next slide, slide 18, approval process. There we go. So this is a quick overview of the different steps that I was mentioning before. I did not mention experimental. Experimental would be an extra step for systems that are not conventional. So for a system to automatically fall under the piloting frame on here, I believe they have to be NSF certified to achieve that 50% load reduction. I can't remember exactly which NSF that is, but if they already have that endorsement from NSF as a nitrogen removing system, then they can automatically go to the piloting. If they don't, if it's a new technology that somebody comes in and says, hey, this is new, but I don't have any accreditations for it, or it's in its infancy stages, they have to go under this additional experimental step. But you can see under provisional, they have to install 20 systems, bi-monthly sampling for 24 months rolling average. Again, they got to stay under 19 milligrams per liter. And if they do, then they can go on to the general use provision. And once they're in the general use, you can see the sampling requirements drop down significantly. Next slide. And so the county's looking forward in terms of how it's attacking its sanitary code changes. There's a lot of sensitivity among policymakers on cost. And so the first thing that we did was we broke down policy changes and proposed sanitary code changes into two phases. The first phase are kind of low-hanging fruit. What can we do right now that is no additional cost generally to the homeowners, the residential population? And so that really just involved dismissing or getting rid of this concept that the county used to have. It's kind of an old, antiquated policy on what's called grandfathering. Basically, commercial property, if it was allowed some flow or permitted some flow, say 40 years ago, before standards were in place, and it was a restaurant that was way over what was protective of the environment, they were allowed to keep that status forever, basically. Even if the restaurant went out of business for, say, 10 years or 20 years, somebody could come in with that permit and say, I want to open this restaurant again. Per the code, it was allowed. Now that's not allowed. If they want to keep that status, they have to install advanced nitrogen system, removal system. And then the second phase of that was just some reporting requirements for pump out facilities and failing systems. And so then phase two are going to be some of the harder questions and harder things to sell to policymakers. And, you know, they could be the requirements for requiring these new systems on new construction, requiring these new systems on, say, antiquated system failure. So if a cesspool fails and somebody comes to the county and says they would want to install a new cesspool, well, if they're in, say, a sensitive area that the county says, the county could say, nope, you're required to install only these new systems. So similarly, requiring them on property transfer, and possibly taking a look at zoning, minimum zoning to be protective of the environment. And those are those decisions the county recognizes are very sensitive, again, to costs, and they're going to be backed exactly which policy interventions to implement and when to implement them are going to be backed and supported by this sub-watersheds wastewater management plan that we'll talk about in a minute. Next slide, slide 20. This is honorable mention. We have a pretty antiquated database system in the county going back 30 years or so. And so part of the overall upgrade project and this overall wastewater management program is the installation of a new, what we're calling environmental health system information management system. It's basically going to be the electronic backbone for the responsible management entity. It's going to help us track performance data and management, help identify enforcement actions when necessary. It's also going to provide a web-based portal for the different industry. It's really going to bring things into the current century and help make a smooth transition for this responsible management entity. So that project just started moving forward. They're actually, they've been working hard. I see people running around here every day, crazy, trying to get this thing up and running, different groups and stuff. But just wanted to mention that it's an important element of the program. So let's go next slide, which is the Septic Improvement Program. You can go on to slide 22, actually. And so in 2017, Executive Blown signed into law that established basically a grant and loan program to facilitate and promote the installation of these innovative alternative systems. And you can go next slide, slide 23. And so the funding available is about $2 million a year, and I think there was funding committed for about 5 years, so maybe about total of $10 million at this point in time. And the basic framework of the program is that if a homeowner falls within a certain sensitive area, the county has a separate quote-unquote priority area map for this program. They could be be eligible for a grant of up to $11,000. And they've also been working with CDC-LI on low-interest loans to cover what traditionally is the majority of the remaining costs. Existing systems at this point in time, in terms of total costs coming in, probably average around $20,000 in the county. Every site's different, as you all know. Simple sites are coming in cheaper. More complicated sites where you have tight site conditions and require more site restoration cost more. But generally, between these two options, it can be no initial out-of-pocket cost to the homeowner. The county has just been awarded an additional $10 million from New York State, and the state had passed, Governor Cuomo had passed a $75 million program dedicated to the upgrade of antiquated cesspools or antiquated wastewater technology statewide. The county was fortunate that we're kind of ahead of the pack in terms of where we are in terms of wastewater management, and funding priority for the initial rollout went to counties that already had a program established. So we were fortunate to get about $10 million out of the $15 million for the first rollout of the funding. And so that's going to make, for a lot of the homeowners, that's going to increase the allowable grant up to $20,000 and allow a lot of the homeowners to get basically a free system, which is pretty cool. And part of the, you can go to the next slide, slide 24. As part of this program, to make sure that it worked smoothly and efficiently, and to make sure that costs were controlled, and everybody was kind of an equal playing field, we actually sent out requests for quotations from different vendors and different design professionals to apply to a program. They had to meet certain requirements, and both experience-wise and cost-wise. And if they applied and they got approved, then they were going to be on our list. And this list basically is published on our website for homeowners to use. And the ones that are approved on this list are allowed to participate in our program. And so that was a pretty important factor to help, again, keep costs controlled to make the program successful. Next slide. Let's go to the Suffolk County Subwatersheds Wastewater Plan. And so I mentioned before, you can actually go to slide 26, that the way, I guess, I like to think of this plan, I almost think of it as a planning study / feasibility study. And again, this is going to kind of be our science-based bridge to help us transition from these demo and these grant programs to how do we implement a county-wide upgrade program. We want to do it based on science and based on a need. So ultimately, this is going to provide what we're calling like this recommended blueprint for wastewater upgrades, which is going to set priorities, who should get funding first. It's going to set initial nitrogen load reduction goals. How low do I need to go in order to create conditions conducive for water quality restoration? And then also look at funding streams, industry readiness, and develop a phased approach for implementation, because we're not going to be able to hit a light switch, press go, and then have enough staff within the county to run a program. The industry is not going to be ready in terms of availability of product, design professionals, installers, and so forth. So this plan is supposed to help provide recommendations on both the science side and provide a recommendation on how to implement a program in a phased approach. That balance is also not taking 200 years to complete. And so the science side of it's going to include, or does include, establishing the watershed boundaries we break down the county into 191 different subwatersheds or individual water bodies. We're also looking at drinking water and just groundwater in general. For each of those subwatersheds, we've established predicted nitrogen loads. That was one of the graphics that we looked at before. We've also developed residence time or flushing times using a surface water model. And we've established baseline water quality. And then using these different pieces, so to speak, these different science pieces, model outputs, and baseline water quality, that's what we use to establish what we're calling priority areas. And again, the intent of the priority areas is really an infinite amount of funding is not going to be available first. We wish it would, and that wouldn't be an issue, but we're going to have to spend funding carefully and appropriately. And so where should we be spending money first in order to see the most, who needs it first, both in terms of immediate public health risks and impacts, and balancing cost effectiveness, where are we going to see the most benefit for the dollar, so to speak. And so, once we have our priority area set up, once we have initial, what I'm calling load reduction goals, then once we have some assumed funding sources, which we do, we can kind of look at, well, are these funding sources that we are pursuing right now going to be sufficient? How should they be spent? At what point should different policy options like possibly requiring upgrades at new construction or requiring a property transfer, when should they be enacted? And just generally looking at developing, again, an overall recommended approach to implementing a countywide wastewater upgrade program with these new systems. Next slide, slide 27. So this is a rough draft right now, kind of where we stand for the plan itself. All the modeling is complete. We kind of have all the pieces, the outputs of the plan, but with 191 sub-watersheds, we have 191 uniquely ranked water bodies and unique load reduction goals. We didn't set out to have 191 wastewater management areas that we wanted to track in the county. We wanted to start small and then use those pieces to develop larger, more manageable wastewater management areas. And so what this map is really just a very rough first cut at establishing these larger wastewater management areas. And the red areas on here generally represent what are called priority rank 1, or the worst water quality water bodies, the highest risk to nitrogen pollution. Yellow areas are second rank, green are third rank, and the blue areas, which unfortunately aren't many on here, are generally the water bodies that have the lowest sensitivity or current or general to nitrogen, or generally have good water quality. Going with the next slide, 28, going with that map, there will be a table. This is a very rough draft of work in progress. That's why there's a bunch of TBDs in there. But this is basically going to be the framework for those individual wastewater management areas that would identify the wastewater management number, give it a name, list out all the water bodies that are included in it, identify all the individual load reduction goals and individual sensitivity ranks, but then also show what the aggregated management area reduction goal and sensitivity rank ultimately is going to be. Next slide, 29. And so one of the interesting initial findings so far is that I think when we set out with this program, everybody was of the mindset that load reduction goals would kind of follow a nice normal distribution or linear distribution, and would fall somewhere between, say, I'm making this up right now, but for discussion purposes, but say 20 to 50%. What we found with the study is that's not the case. And this is just a quick summary of the number of water bodies that fall within different load reduction goal distributions. And so what we find is there's a whole bunch of water bodies that we're saying, based on current water quality, don't require load reductions currently. And then you kind of have this middle ground between 0% and 60%, which is the sweet spot that everybody initially thought most of the water bodies would fall under. We only, out of the 191, coming up with about a little over 30 of them. And then all of a sudden there's a huge jump of load reduction goals, water bodies that fall under load reduction goals of 60% or greater. And so that was pretty eye-opening, and it's just a function of the population density, where it happens to lie, and the relative geometry and sensitivity of the water bodies, unfortunately, that a lot of the water bodies with high density happen to fall around water bodies that are very susceptible to nitrogen. So very interesting, and the takeaway from this is that this wastewater upgrade program is essential for one, but it's also not going to be the end, because for a lot of these water bodies, if these innovative alternative systems reduce nitrogen by 70%, a lot of the water bodies, they're going to have some other sort of intervention that they're going to be needed to get them to the load reduction goal, whether it's fertilizer management or something else like PRBs or other technologies. Okay, next slide. Slide 30, just about wrapped up here. I just want to talk a minute quickly and So the county recognizes ultimately there's so much sensitivity to cost among, and rightly so, with local taxes, cost implications to homeowners amongst the policymakers. And so ultimately the county knows that unless there's a funding mechanism identified for this program, most of those policy interventions are going to fall on deaf ears, and they're never going to be able to move forward because, for the most part, we've already experienced it here. The legislators are just not going to approve forcing a homeowner to spend thousands of dollars. It's not going to happen. So identifying stable recurring revenue source is essential. And the county's been working hard on it. And in parallel with that, has been working hard on what they're calling the establishment of a water quality improvement district that would provide the framework to allow creating this revenue stream in the county. So next slide, 31. A couple of benefits to this water quality improvement district. Again, it would actually help provide an overall framework for wastewater management in the county, including both sewer and innovative alternative programs, so that they're not separate programs. And ultimately, it would also house the responsible management entity, and it would also consolidate. Right now, for sewers, we have a bunch of individual sewer districts. Would help consolidate them into one tier, and then this would be a mechanism to administer uniform billing and provide a resource that could have the, I'm not sure what the proper term is, but allow us to obtain a revenue stream and manage that revenue stream. And so a couple of funding mechanisms that we're looking at. One is similar to the state of Maryland's Bay Restoration Fund, where anybody with a septic system, residential, commercial, pay modest monthly fee into the fund to offset the cost of, ultimately that would go into a common fund that could be bonded, and it'll offset some of the costs and provide these grants to homeowners for the installation of innovative alternative systems. Another thing that the county has been working hard on is this concept of a water quality protection fee, which is going to be a small surcharge based on water usage. Could be $1 per 1,000 gallons. Suffolk County, relative to the cost of water in the rest of the country, has some of the cheapest water by far, 2 or 3 times lower than the cost of most water throughout the country. So generally $1 per 1,000 gallons, I think it would add up to, for most homeowners, about $120 per year, or somewhere in that framework. So not a lot of money. And then there are some existing programs that are out there. New York State and federal cost share. We already mentioned the New York State program that we got right now with the $10 million. There's additional monies out there. Hopefully there'll be additional monies in the future. And there's some existing county funds, like this Assessment Stabilization Reserve Fund, which is currently paying for that county grant program. And we'll add. Hopefully, I know I was flying there, and I apologize for missing the next slides here and there, but I was keeping an eye on the clock.
Good. No,
a lot of information.
We appreciate the time you've given us already, and let me thank you again for that, and ask the committee to jump in with questions. We have a group that wants to talk about another issue a little bit later, and can they just ask them? Could you give us 20 minutes, or how's your time frame? Is that all right? Okay. Would you mind? Thank you. Questions from the committee? Comments?
Okay.
Steve.
Ken, can you hear me?
I can hear. It's a little bit.
Lean in and
Do you know?
see
It's a
if
little
that's
bit. It's a little bit tough to hear on my end.
Is this better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's just a function of the acoustics. It's not the you're loud
okay.
enough. The acoustics are kind of muffling things up a little bit. But
Did you hear?
shoot away.
Did you hear anything from any of your vendors about the possibility of even higher performance, such as 10 milligrams per liter?
So that is definitely something that's on the table, and the preliminary results of that subwatershed's wastewater plan are strongly suggesting that we're going to need that, right? And parallel to the money that the county is getting from New York State, that money was actually split into two. There's also half of that money for the grant that I work under. This kind of like startup money is going to what's called the Center for Clean Water Technology that was established at a local university, Stony Brook University. And their mission is actually to evaluate and develop new low-cost technologies that can beat the 19 milligrams per liter and come up with something that can get below 10 milligrams per liter for a low cost. And so definitely it's in the works. It's going to be needed. We've been, as part of the demo programs, in addition to what they'll call like the base model of these innovative alternative systems, we also have a few of the systems that have what are called polishing units on them. And I think a lot of them rely on these lime sulfur chambers. And I know in a couple of them, they've had very good performance. I want to say the effluent on a couple of them is down at around 3 or 4 milligrams per liter or somewhere around there. So, so they're looking into it. We've also met with a gentleman, I think Dr. Daniel Smith, on potentially looking at something like a more physical removal mechanism like zeolite. And so science-wise, it's very promising in that it doesn't rely on the biological aspect of it, but it's his experiments and where he is in terms of product development is very much in its infancy stages, but knowing what we know and how low that we need to go, we are the county is very interested in it. And I know they've been working with him to develop a quote unquote prototype and get some of those in the ground in the county under that experimental system program.
Thank you. And one other question. If you limit yourself to requiring installation of an IA only if there's a failure, new construction, or sale of a property, have you calculated how many years it will take to get about 80% IAs?
We have not. That's definitely going to be, I know they have the numbers in terms of, number of property transfers per year, new construction, all that stuff. I have not seen the figures myself. What I do know is, which is the harsh reality, is in terms of a funding source. Some of the funding sources that I've seen, which sound like a lot, like for example, I've seen numbers thrown around of say $75 million a year, but then that $75 million, not all of it's going to go for these grants. You got to administer the program, implement the program. Some of it will go to special projects, clustering, stuff like that, possibly other interventions. Nonetheless, even with this magnitude of problem, even if $30 or $40 million a year were set aside for installation of these innovative alternative systems, initial math, you're still talking 50, 60, 70 years in the most critical areas. That's not even for like countywide. That's just if we wanted to upgrade in those critical red areas. So funding, it's clear that finding a funding source is going to be huge. It's huge. It's everything. And
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the committee here? Ron.
Thanks, Eric. Ron Zweig here. First of all, thank you very much. It was a very, very informative talk and very detailed. We appreciate that level of detail with what we're facing as well. We're in similar challenges here. Just a couple of broad questions. One is, I understand there's some folks from this area that had been working in Long Island, and they had been exploring the use of permeable reactive barriers as part of the solution. And I'm wondering whether you're aware of those and if that's an option that's also being looked at.
So the answer is yes and yes. I know there's a few, we have like a tracking sheet, there was a few proposals on the table for different projects throughout the county, pilot projects we'll call them. Definitely heard of them. They're near and dear to my heart because I came from consulting about 3 years ago, and my background, like my focus area, I'll call it specialty, was PRBs and in situ treatment technologies like that. And so they're on the table, and part of the objective of the subwatersheds plan is to identify these water bodies, which we've already started doing and have a pretty good handle on it. We just looked at identify the water bodies that wastewater is not going to do it alone. It'll also do a quick cost-benefit analysis on some of those other interventions. This plan and all the work that we're doing, in addition to being a county reclaimer water initiative, also falls under New York State DEC has this initiative, the Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan. And it's actually the New York State DEC/Long Island Regional Planning Council program. It's a larger umbrella that's, so the wastewater plan is particularly focused on wastewater, but the Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan is focused on all sources of nitrogen. And so that's where the ball will be picked up, so to speak. Take the information from what we learned from this subwatersheds wastewater plan, and then the Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan, or potentially other county initiatives, you know, depending on where things go, might step in and pick it up too. Would pick up the ball and kind of take the next steps for looking at those other technologies. But you know, my gut reaction on PRBs is definitely promising, and but have to be like anything, have to be designed and installed carefully to ensure that they're, because you kind of get one shot with those. It's not like a above grade system where you can maintain it and upgrade components. If you don't get it right the first time, you have some problems. But definitely a tool that's in the toolbox, promising, and there's definitely mechanisms in place to kind of take the next steps once this plan is done.
Great, thanks. I think Ron has a follow-up.
Just a couple more, just quickly. On the western end of Long Island in the sound close to New York City, there's a $1 billion oyster program. I think it's just $1 billion right now, but it's just to reestablish oyster reefs in part for water quality management, and I'm wondering if that's also considered in the eastern part of the island.
It is, and I don't know all the different programs and details that are out there. You know, there's a bunch of different organizations promoting different individual programs like the Nature Conservancy, Sea Grant, but I've been in meetings where they've talked about oyster pilot programs similar to what you just mentioned for both not only economic benefit like harvesting and stuff like that, but then the side benefit of actual water filtering. And so I know they've been talked about. I know that Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan also has they just hired someone, I can't remember their exact title, but it has to do with aquaculture and bioharvesting. And so they are also looking at developing the framework and starting to build the framework and the pieces necessary to make the use of aquaculture, like using kelp as a means, again, of both economic, potential economic area, but then also the side benefit of, well, let's do this in areas where other interventions are going to be necessary to reduce nitrogen, where we're not going to get there with wastewater alone. So that's been on the table. There's been discussions, and I don't know where they're going to go, but
Yeah, that's true.
Hydro modifications, you know.
Virginia here has a question for you, Ken.
Hi, Ken. I wanted to focus in a little bit on the technologies. The first thing that struck me in your process from going to pilot to ultimately to general use is how much more lenient you are than state of Massachusetts in moving through that process and the number of units that are installed. Is that consistent all the way across Long Island? Or that's a state process?
That was crafted based off models from other jurisdictions. So I think statewide, I think we're kind of like the pioneers, so to speak. And the concept was, and we'll see, it's subject to, I'm going to say the programs, like any new program of this magnitude will be subject to quote-unquote adaptive management. But the initial thought process was twofold. One, we want to keep the cost to the homeowner at a minimum. We also want to make sure that we get the data we need to ensure these systems are working. But the general thought was, once you achieve general approval process, if at first blush, once every 3 years, doesn't sound like enough. Oh, it doesn't sound like a lot to me. I had to be sold on it too. But then the thought process was, well, if you have 50,000 of these things installed, your database of 50,000 of them, you're still going to have, each year, you're still going to have a robust database to ensure that generally you're maintaining your 19 milligrams per liter. And the thought process is, not every single system, every single place is always, everybody knows that their biological processes, they're sensitive, and so it's going to reach 19 on every single sample. But if the countywide average is 19 milligrams per liter, especially within specific subwatersheds, and we do have 50,000 of these things installed, I don't remember what the exact numbers were for one every three years, but it was still a very healthy sample pool annually, that would allow us to just say generally, okay, we're on track. But we've received definitely some questions and comments about that. Is that going to be enough? And again, that'll be subject to, I think, probably scrutiny, program, subject to change possibly based on adaptive management, how things go, I guess.
Okay. And then my second question was about the particular 6 or 7 technologies that had made it through your system, the HydroAction, the FujiClear. I am understanding that correctly? Those have all reached the general use stage, or they're still in the provisional stage?
Everything is still in the provisional stage.
Okay. Was a system called Nitrex by Lombardo Associates, do you know whether that was evaluated as a technology?
Was that the, I heard Lombardo. Were you thinking of the Nitrex system?
The Nitrex,
that we said?
Was that part of the list of technologies that were evaluated?
So my understanding, and hopefully I don't misrepresent this, but I think we reached out to them, and for financial reasons, they declined to participate in the demo program.
Okay, and the point of your demo program was that the systems had to be donated, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
I think that was the issue. But my understanding is they are going to, and I could be wrong in this, pursue, you don't have to get in through the demo program. The demo program just gives you, like looking back at that table of the approval process, the demo program just could get you approval within 6 months as opposed to 1 year. It just gives you a little bit of an edge in terms of the marketplace. And my understanding was that they were going to participate as part of the pilot program, but I could be wrong in that. I'm not sure exactly. But
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Ken, thank you. You've given us an enormous amount of very useful information. We very much appreciate it. I think we'll be printing it up and distributing it to the members, if we can, with your email. So in case anyone has specific questions to follow up, they'll be able to reach you. Would that be all right?
Absolutely. And I apologize for the technology issues. I don't know what was going on there, but
We're going to blame Eric.
I think
It's not your fault.
But yeah, no, definitely feel free to my line's open. Feel free to give me a buzz or shoot me an email. And if I don't know the answer to certain questions, I definitely know the people that do know the answer. So, yeah, I
Good.
appreciate you guys having me. And
Thank you very much.
all right, you're welcome. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Comments, questions before we move on to Mill Pond?
Well, the elephant in the room is that he's under, seems to me, very different political constraints than we are. Is that true? Or
He doesn't
you need
have-
to educate me on the
He
difference?
doesn't seem to have a DEP breathing down his neck.
Exactly.
Yes, in fact, it seemed to me it was the reverse, that they were going to do the studies of which watersheds were the priority after they had started these experiments with the technologies. Maybe they think they were running in parallel, but we know how long it takes to study a particular estuary. It's not something you knock off in 6 months.
I just wonder if the real estate values in the blue areas are going up now that these maps are.
The scale of the problem is horrifying.
Yes,
Yes,
Really?
350,000.
and the fact that sewering
Yeah, that's,
was not cost-effective, I'm still trying to figure out why that is a true statement, because their density is greater than our density.
his figure was $60,000 to $100,000 per residence.
For a sewer, yes, and I don't know whether he has the capital cost of the plant included in that?
I don't know, but I was enjoying their income limits too for getting financial help.
Yes, right, 300,000.
Jerry Seinfeld in the Hamptons won't qualify for the grant.
Yeah,
I don't think anyone here would be disqualified.
I don't think by the time you're over $500,000 in income per year, you're gonna worry too much about an $11,000 system,
No.
or $11,000 gift.
Well, we did learn a lot. It makes us kind of feel like we're on the right track and ahead of the curve in a lot of places.
Yes.
We should print these things up and distribute them to the members because it's useful stuff. Hey, any other comments on this before we move on to Little Mill Pond? Good, Mill Pond. Come forward and sit in the front row at least, if you don't mind. Okay, as everyone remembers, the town did a study of Mill Pond, which was having algae and smell problems last summer. The study came back recently, and we had a presentation with the neighborhood at the East Falmouth Church. And the study actually came back with some very specific proposed action items, which, Virginia, if you could summarize those, we should talk about what your reaction is and where you want to go with this.
Right. Mary Ellen has a copy of the report, and we're very interested in what your reaction is to it. Because the recommendation section basically had four subparts to it. And I think that Brian Howes and Amber Unruh put them in more or less what they thought were ease of implementation, so that there's sort of, they didn't use the word priorities, but ease of implementation. And so the first one was to work with the grower on a number of changes and improvements to the cranberry operation that is farther to the north, is upstream, and that is allowing a lot of vegetation to come down the stream and then be a problem in Mill Pond. And so without knowing any particular details about the conversation between Mr. Howes and the grower, or Amber and the grower, I don't think we can get into the specifics, but I would be interested whether the community would want to be part of that conversation or help move that conversation forward. So that was what the authors put as the top of the pile. The second piece that they put was what they called pond macrophyte management, by which they meant basically removal of the existing, as we look across, all of that greenery, and it's both water lilies and floating algae of various sorts. And that there is a machine that will do that. It's on Cape. Apparently it has been done in another community down Cape. And we would need to, we being the town, would need to know what the cost to rent that machine was. There undoubtedly would be a permitting process through the Conservation Commission. And so somebody needs to lead that through. That being the second order of business. The third was actually improving the oxygen environment in the pond, and that would need a mechanical means, some kind of, I'm just going to use the general word, aerator. And the point there was to keep the water from getting too anoxic. It does need an electrical supply. It needs to be there most of the year. I think they said at least 6 months of the year. So there are different challenges to doing the aeration option. And then the fourth one that was evaluated was suggested, or at least the topic was raised at the meeting when this committee reviewed the draft, and that was simply not to have the pond and to not make it dammed at Route 28. There's a series of boards, and you could obviously undam it. You would no longer have Mill Pond. You would have Mill, not swamp, but something like that. It would become a wetland, is more, with a stream running through it. And that obviously would need input from the local community as to how they felt about that. Obviously, if there's no water there, it won't be anoxic, so there would be point. So I just wanted to very briefly summarize what's in this section, and then we really want to know what you're thinking.
Right, and if you wouldn't mind using the microphone so our, at least townwide audience can, yes, please.
My name is Mary Ellen Alwant. I'm president of the East Falmouth Village Association. And I want to thank you for letting me know that you were discussing this at this meeting. After Virginia reviewed the 4 points, I can't speak for everyone. The first thing I would like to mention is I don't think the residents that live around the pond or even the whole village of East Falmouth would not like to see a pond there. The whole idea of bringing this up to the town was that something needed to be done to restore it to what it used to look like years back. So I'm pretty sure that that one would be taken off. Working with the grower, I think that would be good. What I'd really like to do is have an East Falmouth board meeting, and I would like to discuss this with our board and maybe do a letter to the residents and point out what options have come forward from this study, and then I could get back to you on the general feeling of the whole village as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, very good.
Okay.
None of these seem to be awfully expensive,
Right,
which is good.
right.
So if we're thinking about the town funding this, I mean, if it's a small amount, Water Quality Committee could, if it was, like the last study was something the town funded.
Town art.
We should probably get these 3 options costed out so that you have a sense of that.
I think it's important to add here, too, that their approach is adaptive. We can try the easiest, what appears to be the most satisfactory one, and after a year or 2 or whatever, we don't see the improvements we're looking for. I think we're going to probably play other cards and see what happens. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that it's not all or nothing. If one thing doesn't work, we're giving up.
Exactly, and I'm sure that's what our board is going to come up with. Like I said, I don't want to speak for everyone, yeah, they'd probably start with, well, let's pull the greens out and see how much of an effect that has on it. And then probably, like you say, take steps to go forward. But I would like to include the residents.
Oh, sure. Brian Howes was very enthusiastic about that one, the removal of the greens. And
Because they'll grow back.
and he thought somebody in Dennis had a machine and was doing it, and then we could rent the machine and have something happen.
Okay. How would I go about getting costs for each one of these? How would that be something that would come after I come back to you, or is that something that I can work on in the meantime? Is that something you can help me with?
Yeah.
I think we should ask the grower about the costs for the grate
Okay.
and the retention basin. And we should ask Brian Howes, since he's the one that has the contact for the crop removal, for the vegetation remover, if he could at least either tell us what he knows or give us a contact person for who's in charge of that particular piece of machinery. That would at least begin to give us some dollars.
He could give us the contact on the aeration, too.
Yeah, I was
yes,
just
he
going to ask
probably could.
about
Yeah.
that.
Well,
Aerator.
Where are we on aeration? Is there technology available currently that does what we want to do here, or where are we?
So the Mashpee does have a pond where they have 6 of the solar bees. I think they cost somewhere around $360,000 to put in. There's been the past 2 years, I think there were big algae blooms, so they're not quite sure what's going on with that, whether it's something with the solar bees or if it's just something else. There's another technology that we've looked at in the past, and I actually opened up a discussion with those people earlier today. It's a very small bubble size. It doesn't rise to the surface. So we're still awaiting more information on that. But the macro aeration systems, and I think Brian Howes did mention that they're not normally recommended, but there are some people working on technologies that may be useful. So we'd have to do a little bit more exploration to get the costs and see if it's feasible.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying $360,000 for 6 solar bees.
Yeah.
Based on the 2 that they were, in another discussion, were being suggested for oyster pond. Am I not right? That mill pond is much smaller than oyster pond.
Yes,
So you'd probably need 1, so you're talking 60,000.
Again, you'd have to get a current price from the vendor, and
but I
that
didn't
may
wanna scare
that may be
people
more.
away with-
You know, it's not just the equipment; it's the installation, operation, all that. So, just a rough order of magnitude.
The rate of turnover in mill pond might be higher because of its upstream flow coming in than oyster pond may not have the same dynamic also. Because you have a lot of water coming through, it's hard to know if there's a problem, then.
And that is a significant point, that it's different from the other place where there's solar bees. It's a static pond, basically.
Right.
The other thing is that we need to think about the bathymetry of Mill Pond. It's very shallow, except for one area that has a kettle hole. I don't know what's the depth that these solar bees need to operate on. And we'd have to, that might turn out to be a limitation, that there are areas that just aren't deep enough for it to sit there and do its thing.
There's also a paddle wheel technology, but when you start putting all these gadgets on the pond, I think that the aesthetic is going to change pretty fundamentally, more so than even eliminating the pond.
Yeah, as I said, there are a couple other things that we haven't had a chance to vet, but we're looking at, so.
Also, in line with what Tom was saying, if you do several things at once, you have the problem of not knowing which one caused the
works.
result.
Right.
That makes
Right.
sense.
Right.
Good enough.
My inclination certainly would be the first 2, I think, are pretty obvious.
Yep.
And
Yep.
go after the retention pond and the grate with Handy, and think about the harvester, if we could rent that from Dennis. I think those are 2 reasonable steps. I certainly would try those before I thought about aeration.
And I'm sure that's the conclusion the board is going to come to. But like I said, I'd like to get everyone involved so that
Right.
they know something is happening.
When does your board meet?
I can schedule a meeting this month.
Maybe we should get some answers from the grower and
Yes.
Brian, so that you can have some numbers to go to them with. So why don't we chase that around and we'll get you those numbers and you can schedule your meeting.
Okay, that works for me.
Sound good?
Yep.
You know,
Wonderful.
I just want to thank you all immensely, again, for getting involved in this project, because it means so much to our village. It really does.
Well, it's a
Thank
very visible pond, so,
It
you
is,
know,
it
I
is.
saw it happening, and I live in North Falmouth, so
Yeah.
I care about it too.
that's right,
Thank
everybody
you.
goes by that pond.
And likes it.
Really, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now, our next item, apparently more controversial than you would have thought. Okay. There's a proposal to, which I think has been sent around to all the members, a one-page, everybody see this? A one-page email, sort of laying out the proposal here that talks about somewhere between $1,575 over 3 years or $4,725 over 3 years. Eric, do you want to lay out why you
You
think
want to
it's...
give me a little talk through it, or?
You can talk through it, I'd say, and then we'll have a rebuttal from Matt.
So I think the committee's probably familiar with the Wacoit Bay system, the MEP report that came out in 2013. I guess there was an update, came to a conclusion that about 17,000 kilograms per year of nitrogen should be taken out. There was a 2015-208 plan update from the Cape Cod Commission that suggested that Falmouth's share was about 53% of that. Which would be 12,000 kilograms of nitrogen per year. If you apply that 53% to the 17,000, you come up with a little over 9,000 kilograms that Falmouth would be responsible for removing. Again, those are round numbers. Just to give us an order of magnitude for what we're looking at, there's some alternative technologies that have been under consideration, taking a look at adjusting fertilizer practices, stormwater measures, and changes in atmospheric deposition. Takes care of some of that load reduction, but there's still an additional need of thousands of kilograms per year. Shellfish are one possible technology that could be used, and denitrifying septic systems are another, in addition to sewering. One of the things that happened since both of those targets were set is that last year, the Falmouth Board of Selectmen approved the transfer of the old 23-acre aquaculture grant that was the first shellfish grant in Massachusetts to be transferred to a new owner who started operations this year and has most likely significantly ramped up productivity of that site. This came to my attention when he gave the manager of the facility gave a presentation, Dave Ryan, at Wacoit Bay had a sort of oyster fest in September, and they opened it to the public, and he shared a few of the productivity results that they're seeing there. And so the reason for this discussion is to take a look at how much nitrogen is being taken out by the new grower as opposed to the old grower. And I think everyone's familiar that oysters have, at least the ones that are typically grown around here, a 2-year growth cycle. And in the first year, they get big enough to overwinter, either under the water or on shore. And during the second year, they go from whatever that size was up to the size they can be on your plate, which is, if you're recreational harvesting, 3 inches. If you're grower, you can do 2.5 inches, called the petite market. So in November 2007, Wacoit Bay, the town of Mashpee, had a report from Stearns and Wheeler where they looked at using oysters, and they found it sort of highlighted in, or not highlighted in this text, that 160,000 oysters had 50 kilograms of nitrogen, which works out to be 0.31 grams of nitrogen per oyster. And then they said seeding will continue with the goal of harvesting 1 million oysters, removing 500 kilograms of nitrogen, which is 10% of what they need to remove for the MEP target. And if you do the math, that's 0.5 grams per nitrogen, more than they had found previously, but they're anticipating that that would work out. Well, GHD has subsequently done some additional analysis. This is May 2015. You can see that up in the, sorry, it's not a very dark thing there, but at any rate, the significant thing here is that they'll project a shellfish harvest of a certain number of metric tons. That's what the MT stands for. And they have this 500 tons as they had before. And they suggest that that would come from 5 million oysters. And so each oyster, as you see in note 3 down here, is 100 grams. So I'm not sure how many people have bought oysters at the shellfish market, but typically they are not 100 grams a piece. And we'll talk about that a little bit. There's a study that Josh Retzman, a number of other people did, and Rick York, who works in Mashpee, was involved in this work as well, where they reported the nitrogen that's been found in shellfish throughout Cape Cod, and they looked at shellfish from many different places, not just one. They came up with an average here of 0.28 grams per animal, not 0.5 grams per animal, and a 0.69% nitrogen by total dry weight. And it's important to us to understand what total dry weight actually is. This is a table of the data that went into that report that Josh published, and we can see 3 different values for the total nitrogen per animal of 0.29, 0.39, and 0.32 for 3 different locations in Mashpee. They're the Mashpee River and 2 in Pompanesett Bay. And all these values are less than the 0.5 that they suggested. And I think it's notable also that the whole weight of the animals was significantly less than 100 grams. So these projections that Stearns and Wheeler and GHD used were not aligned with what the study was producing. And again, I think if you go to the oyster markets in town, you can verify what the weight of an oyster is. Just buy 10 and put them on a scale. One of the other important things to keep in mind is that these percents of nitrogen per animal are based on the percent of the dry weight of the animal, which is what you get when you separate the shell from the tissue and dry them in a desiccating oven. And that's not practical to do on a large scale. If you're running an aquaculture program, you're going to weigh your live animals as they're coming out of the water. You're not going to process them. And so the whole weight that is obtained in this report in the green here is actually a better metric to look at. And you can just take the whole animal nitrogen content and divide it by the whole weight, and you come up with numbers that are in the range of this 0.5% that was actually behind the number that was used previously. However, I'd like to point out a couple things. One is that the 0.5% could be 0.57, it could be 0.44. And if you look at the bottom of this chart, there was a sample taken in Pleasant Bay in Orleans, and some of you may be aware that there's a fairly large-scale demonstration project taking place there, that the DEP is looking at actually giving the town credit for nitrogen removal as part of their CWMP. There's a process that's happening right now, and Brian Dudley and people are involved in that, and they like what they see, but what they want to see is you measure the nitrogen percent of your oysters and state it as a percent of the harvest weight of those oysters, and they've expressly stated this. And turns out that although Josh's paper found a 0.55% content, the oysters in this actual project were 0.32% of the harvest weight. And the DEP is fine using that number, but they want to know where it came from. So some of the thinking behind this proposal is that if we look at this site, there's the Mashpee River up here and Pompanesett Bay down here. We had 0.57% in Mashpee River, 0.44 in Pompanesett Bay. Neither one of those is particularly close to Sea Pit River. If there's any intent to get credit for what's going on at the new growers operation in Sea Pit River, we should measure that value. And so the goal is to move towards a standard that's in line with what the DEP seems to be excited about, which is actually measuring the percent of the harvest weight that is nitrogen in the shellfish from the project that you're getting credit for. And just taking a look at Dave Ryan's numbers, it's possible that he may have ramped things up by something on the order of 500 kilograms of nitrogen per year relative to what the previous grower was doing. We won't know that number until we actually test the shellfish for their nitrogen content. If that 0.5% turns out to be correct, it's probably going to be around 750 kilograms. But if it's 0.32, it might be under 500 kilograms. At any rate, no matter how you look at it, it's probably going to be somewhere in that 5% range. Not a huge, it's not like the whole thing, but again, it's hundreds of kilograms of nitrogen that we're looking at. The DEP has expressed an interest in having 3 years of history in terms of what your productivity is. The grower is already tracking his biomass. He doesn't count oysters or measure shell length, he actually weighs them. And he's willing to provide that information. All we would have to do is combine it with the percent nitrogen content, but that's an expense that normally a grower would not undertake. So the proposition is that the town of Falmouth take on the responsibility for that analysis, combine it with his growing information, and then we'd have a number for how much nitrogen is now coming out of the Sea Pit River that wasn't coming out when the MEP report was done and when the Cape Cod Commission update happened. So that's the pitch.
All right, we got the pitch. Comments, questions from anyone on the committee?
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
So I lost you somewhere along the way there when you're talking about I get it that when you pull an oyster out of the water, it's going to have a different weight than if you put it in a desiccator
Yes.
and you take it to dryness. But I mean, what you really want to know at the end of the day is what's the total amount of nitrogen in grams, right? Dry weight. So what was the point you were trying to make? I realize that it's not practical, but
Yeah.
how does that
So
change?
the idea is that there are differences, and if you read the details of Josh's paper, you see that it has a broad range from estuary to estuary. And as I said, there's also a project that the DEP is looking at very closely, that if you just read Josh's paper, you'd get 0.55. But if you look at the results they got, you're getting at 0.32. So I think the DEP isn't going to take Josh's paper as the gospel on anything at this point. So there is a ratio. This is a very simple thing, but you do have to measure it, specific to the estuary. I guess that's the point. What you do is, Josh sent them up, and the 0.32 number came from the same lab that Josh used, Boston University Stable Isotope Lab. They open up the oyster, they grind up 1 milligram of the tissue and 10 milligrams of shell, put it in a mass analyzer, and then you have a percent.
And those nitrogen differences, you don't think simply have to do with the size of the oyster at harvest?
From what I've seen, no. It's the percentage. If you do the ratio, it's a percentage of the harvest weight, and it's characteristic of the estuary.
Steve?
Expressing what Matt said maybe a little differently, it's known already for various species of oysters, the percent of nitrogen of the dry weight, right?
I guess it depends what you mean by known. If you look at this table right here,
There's a lot of data for in various situations.
it's a range.
And it's a range, and
Yeah.
it always will be a range,
Yes.
which will be my second question. And so all you really need to know is the ratio of dry weight to wet weight, and then you can do the obvious math to get the other ratio.
It's a little bit more intricate because you can find that some tissues of some animals in some estuaries have more nitrogen than the same species in a different estuary. Depends on what they eat, depends on a number of things.
Okay, but then, all right, my second question is, I've never run into anything in my life with more variation than oystering. Not that I know much about oystering, but there's the weather variation, there's which side of bed the oysterman gets out of, equipment failures, biological disease, market factors. It's always going to be a range.
So
And so I sort of question, if you have 4 or 5 parameters that are always going to be a range and that are really rough, and you're never going to really know accurately, what's the point in measuring your 6th thing to any kind of accuracy, since it's going to get put in with the rough one?
I feel like that's a good question. And if I didn't have personal experience, I would feel like it's hopeless. It turns out that if you do enough sampling, you get a number that's very consistent, independent of the variation. So Orleans has seen 0.32% for 2 years in a row with pretty different conditions. There's going to be another number that comes out this year, and we'll see. The thing that's most variable is how many kilograms of oysters you get. And that's why it's very important not to count oysters, but to actually weigh them.
But we're getting that free in any case.
Exactly. Yep. And I just think in
And
terms of...
that I think makes sense, and I think that's incumbent on the commercial, the Falmouth Shellfish Committee and Chuck and the growers and all those people. That's their job.
there's no requirement for the grower to say how many kilograms he's producing at the site directly.
But it's a trivial burden for the town to force them to do it, especially since they're already volunteering to do it.
It would be nice if all the growers had information like this, and if we had information about recreational harvest also, and that's.
But there's tremendous demand to be able to be an oysterman in Falmouth.
I agree.
So Falmouth
They
is in
could
the
impose it.
driver's seat.
Yeah.
And if they only will give you a grant to run your business here, all you have to do is tell us how many pounds you're collecting.
Yeah.
It's a no-brainer. You do it.
I agree. That's part of the proposal, is to have the technical consultant for the committee do some work to make sure that all that information is collected and used properly.
But the other aspect is, this is only meaningful if it's projected to go on forever.
And in a sense, if the oyster actually comes out of the water.
Ron?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It was very, very nice summary. You may not be aware, I suspect you must be aware, but there was a town meeting warrant article that was passed, I think, in the fall of 2016, and to look at the oyster production and nitrogen attenuation as a result in Bourne's Pond. And that was a $75,000 appropriation that included a lot of different analyses. And that program was to start in the summer of 2017, but there was some confusion at the site, and now they apparently did it this year. I haven't heard of any findings yet from that, but I believe it did include analyzing oysters as well as denitrification associated with the aquaculture. And that's an element that is becoming more and more a certainty in terms of the impact of the aquaculture. In other words, denitrification, additional nitrogen removal from the estuary is being driven through microbial denitrification. And, you know, as you're aware, because you've worked in Lonnie's Pond, the nitrogen content in the oysters was measured at 0.282, according to reports that I've seen, grams per animal. But what's interesting is that study there also included two different analyses of associated denitrification. And in one case, done by SMAST, they found that 0.5 kilograms of nitrogen was denitrified per 1 kilogram of nitrogen assimilated into the oyster. And then another AECOM, it's a consulting firm. I don't know what AECOM stands for, AECOM, I'm not sure.
Nobody does.
But anyway, it's probably a list of names. But in any case, in their study, it was 0.67 kilograms of nitrogen per 1 kilogram assimilated into oysters. I think that when you're looking at this, you can't just look at the animal. I mean, it's a nice piece, but if almost 50 to 67% more is removed through denitrification, we need that picture, that number, and that's what the town meeting warrant article financed. And so I think that we should see the results from that. We have all of these numbers that are really pretty close. I mean, as Steve said, I mean, every place is a little different, and they grow a little differently, and you're going to get different averages. And this would be a very unique setting. It would be another data point, just another data point. It wouldn't be the all data point. So I think that first of all, we might want to wait, because it should be soon. Because it should be soon that the data from the SMAST report from this past summer I know that Chuck measured the weight, from what he told me, of all the oysters that he harvested from Bourne's Pond, and that weight is available. And if we have some analyses of those oysters, we can get an idea, an adequate database. We can get an idea of how much nitrogen was in the animals. But on top of that, SMAST should be providing a denitrification number. And so I think that when we get this together, we would need, I think that it's important that for this study, maybe it isn't $5,000 or whatever, maybe it's more, and maybe we do need a town meeting warrant article to see, or some decent funding so that we can get a proper thing rather than piecemealing it with, one part and not the whole. So I think we really need to look at this as the objective, in terms of the objective, which is to improve water quality in our estuaries. And if it's so much comes out in the animals, that's great. But it looks like there's a big, big chunk that is being driven out as a result of the aquaculture operation through microbial denitrification. So I think there's a pretty good database on what's in oysters pretty much. And I know that the Mashpee figure was, I talked with Rick about that at the time, and he said, oh no, I've checked everything is set of the 0.5 grams. But all this other data is showing, including the Lonnie's Pond data, that we're all around between 0.26, 0.3. Well, if they're bottom cultured, it's higher, a little bit higher. So
Do we know what the culturing is here in this
CPID,
grant?
I believe is all, that CPID grant is all, it used to always all be bottom.
Bottom.
all bottoms.
CPID is actually a combination of floating and bottom.
Is it?
Okay, so it would be,
Kelly used to just do bottom.
so that, but we do have data related to that. But I still think that it would be good to look at that project, because the size is great in terms of really what it's doing, not just what's going into growth, but to the overall impact, because otherwise, where are we with that data point? We're not even, we're maybe at
can I respond?
two-thirds of what's coming out. And it needs, I would say, look at this as in terms of the objectives of this committee as assigned by the Board of Selectmen, it isn't just looking at nitrogen and oysters, it's looking at the benefits of shellfish aquaculture.
So I think you've made a good point that denitrification is an important piece of the puzzle. Where it stands with Lonnie's Pond is they don't expect the DEP to give any credit for denitrification based on the results that have been presented so far. The town has an interest in continuing those studies, but the DEP has indicated that they will look at giving credit for the nitrogen removed by uptake through growth. And that's really the point of this, is we're not talking about being able to make better estimates. I agree, we can make very good estimates. What we're talking about is establishing a track record of what actually has been removed that the DEP would take seriously. And it could be begun later. It doesn't need to start now. We could wait a year and let this year's productivity slide by if we wanted to. It's fine. Excuse me, Ron, just let me get through the end of this. I think the magnitude is also important to keep in mind. The Bourne's Pond oysters, about 300,000 oysters. What's going on at the Grant in Septic River is close to 10 times that. And so it's not 50 or so kilograms of nitrogen. It's probably a lot more.
Right.
Matt?
Perhaps to address Ron's concern, I'm aware of a fairly substantial project going on somewhere within Wacoit Bay. I'm not exactly sure where. Funded by the NARES, the National Estuarine Research Reserve.
Stonehill
Science
College is doing that,
Collaborative,
yep.
Yeah, Dan Rogers at Stonehill College, and I think Ginny Edgecombe at
I'm familiar with that
Bowie
also.
is involved. I don't know if it's possible to
They're
pair
doing
these measurements.
They're doing a
with-
nitrogen analysis of those oysters as well, but the growth rate is very different, I can assure you. I've looked at the data.
But they're doing the denitrification part in the sediments.
They're looking at
That's the point that I
denitrification,
wanted
they're
to
also
make.
doing the tissue analysis, and if you look at the sheet that was handed out, it actually mentions that FMES is sending off, I actually pulled the oysters from Bourne's Pond that went up to BU. So, they're doing this, it's just nobody's doing it with the growers' oysters.
Quick question here, just, when they did the MEP study, presumably Kelly's grant was in operation, and whatever benefit it was providing was accounted for in the DEP study, the MEP study. And the wild growers, whatever they were doing was reflected in the MEP study of what where we ought to be. So the only thing DEP's ever going to give us any credit for would be
Incremental,
in whatever we produce above that.
absolutely.
Now, the problem I see is with Kelly, I don't know how good a set of numbers we have from when he was running it, and I know we don't have any good set of numbers at all from the wild guys.
Right.
So
Um,
how do we start with a baseline?
And that is something that Chuck's actually been working on. He's been accumulating some survey data to be able to piece it together for the wild growers. And there are state reports that are available that, part of the proposal here is to work with Chuck to request that information and then try to vet it, do some QA/QC on, are we getting reasonable numbers? And we actually know the people who worked that grant, and we can get information from them too.
I just want to just make it clear, you're relatively new at this, so it's, but even here, okay, I mean, a couple of the last few years, mostly it's been in the Outer Cape, not that that's an issue, but when we started with the oysters, and you should never say never, okay, because when we started with the oysters, DEP just had no interest in any way, which way, up or down. It wasn't even like within the scope of anything. It was really, and now, as you say, they're embracing it to an extent. When it comes to denitrification, they won't have anything to do with that. But if we get the database, if the data, one thing after another, we're getting 0.68 kilograms per kilogram through denitrification. We're getting 0.5 in data measurements. You start getting these year after year after year. It's the same. They're going to say, well, you're showing something here. And to say that it's not going to happen, we wouldn't be looking at any of this right now if we hadn't,
100%
even if Falmouth hadn't pushed it, and especially Mashpee. And now Orleans is on, and Barnstable as well. So it's coming. It's that you can't
Absolutely.
look at things at a fixed point, because we're all getting educated too. We're all getting educated.
Right.
It may not be that denitrification is reliable. It's possible, but it's
find out.
looking good.
I agree with you, Ron, and I think the DEP has indicated they will look at it if you can demonstrate it.
Yeah,
In
well,
the
that's
same
what I'm
way,
talking about.
they're
yeah.
not going to listen to growth without
Let's
a
cut to
percent.
the chase. We've got a commercial grower who's growing a hell of a lot of oysters. He's been doing it forever. It's the biggest commercial operation on the Lower Cape. Let's get the damn data for a very little cost to us.
What data?
By knowing what he's taking out in kilograms
That's-
of nitrogen.
I know, but that's
It's
nothing.
cheap
That's a
data,
point.
and if it's data that's going to impress DEP, let's get it.
But there is a lot coming in. And if every estuary needs to be tested in this way to an extent. I mean, there's gonna have, but we have to look at the whole thing. We have a project now happening in Bourne's Pond. The results should be available in the next few months, I assume. We'll get a report. And at that point, we can say, okay, what do we do? Where do our resources go? What's the next step? Is it to continue that consistency, to try and get an idea from that for 2 or 3 years? Or is it better to start diverting over here, diverting over there? That's the point.
We are going to have to deal with the Wacoit-based system at some point, and if we could show 3 years of knowing what's going on there for oyster growth, they would take note of it.
Yeah.
We
Could
have
I-
a
well,
pro-
Could I make a motion?
I was just going to say, we have a proposal, we have a lot of conversation. Do we have a motion?
I would make a motion to approve the minimum 25 oysters, maybe start with 25 oysters this year.
Mhm.
See what the variability is in the data, and then take it up again next year. If the data comes in really tight,
Okay.
And just on that note, 25 would most likely be from the floating gear, not from the bottom oysters.
Absolutely.
And
Okay.
so we just wouldn't get that information.
I'll second that motion, and I haven't spoken. I think it's important to collect this data because it's site-specific. I think it's important to collect because it's the Wacoit watershed, and I think we need to be working with Mashpee to the degree that we see that works. It gets our foot in the door with a private commercial grower that we haven't had. I think the town working with private commercial growers is a plus. I understand Ron's point about wanting to look at denitrification as well. We'll be much more educated as to what we would be asking this private grower if we want to do the denitrification measurements next year, but we will have established a relationship with them. And by just doing 1 year, I mean, we're talking a very, $1,500?
No,
No,
500
that's for 3 years, so
$500.
$500.
Oh,
was going to be my point. $500 to go ahead and start it this year, and we don't,
And the only downside of that is you're missing the difference of floating versus off the bottom. you
Yeah.
know.
Okay,
Right.
so is 525 the number based on what you've handed us here?
I would recommend doing at 75.
Yes,
Yeah, I
I
would-
know what you're recommending. but
I was
the
trying to
motion-
find
the
out if
motion
Matt
is
was-
My motion
25.
was, I'm sorry, my motion was for $1,575, whether you want to do that over 1 year or spread it out.
So you could do 75 for 1 year, or you can do 25 for 3 years.
Eric, question?
Would you choose one, or what would happen?
If I knew it was only going to be 1,500, I would do 50 this year and decide what to do next year.
Okay, is that,
I have a question. It doesn't say on there, but I guess you are the contractor, right, or Science Wares is?
I don't make any money off this.
I can't
I know what
imagine
you
you
do.
do.
You would collect
Oh.
you
I
would,
could.
No, but I don't, everybody needs to make a living. I just meant, it wasn't clear to me whether it was, you were just asking to allocate part of the contract that you already have toward
No,
this,
no.
or whether this was an additional
additional
contract.
money, presumably for testing and such.
Yeah, I happened to be at the meeting where I saw the numbers that Dave was presenting, and I knew the relevance to Wacoit Bay's watershed. And it seems like the committee would be interested, would be able to use the data in a future CWMP. Looking at,
So
in the
would
same
Chuck-
way if
Chuck
land
be
goes into,
responsible for taking?
Chuck would be the responsible party here.
Chuck could be the one who pulls the oysters. Dave Ryan has to pull the oysters as his grant. Or, not Dave Ryan, he's the one who operates but I could make sure they get sent. Yeah.
If there's $1,570 of town money on the table here, who's responsible for its spending?
Boston University's Stable Isotope Lab would get paid. The
Right.
town of Falmouth
That's
would
the
pay.
vendor.
By Chuck, presumably.
Right. Yeah, I would think putting it in Chuck's lap
Is that
makes the most
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
Okay,
Chuck
fine.
he's paying
Okay.
for the other analysis, so.
fine?
Yeah.
Okay, so the motion's for 1,500, to request the Board of Selectmen to authorize the expenditure from Article 17 of $1,575 for the purposes laid out here.
of collecting
but
75.
specifically, what is that going to buy us? Run through the details again. I got a little confused with the different
That's
numbers.
over 3 years, right?
No, this is 1 year.
This is a 1 year, I think, appropriation for 1 year's effort, and I thought 1 year's effort, that would buy us 75, if you remember my first note.
Yeah, you could,
I was
you
trying to
could-
get as much data as I could.
I think it would be wise to
dollar.
get the on-bottom and the off-bottom. And
Yes.
I know there's been a spring and a fall
Yeah.
planting, so that's why there were 3. We were gonna be able to track all the populations
Right.
that are out there.
I think the seasonal effect is important, at least from what I read in Josh's paper, the one that came out last year.
Okay, so the motion is $1,575 for,
I would do it as 1 year and come back to it next year.
Right, for 75, right,
Yeah.
for the
Yep.
75 oysters is what
To be-
that buys
to be
us,
examined
so.
for the
And
1
just
year.
do it this year and talk
Yep.
about it next
Okay.
year.
Yeah.
Is that what you had in mind?
That's what I had in mind.
Fine, okay.
Good.
Moved and seconded.
I'll second.
Further discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, opposed? You guys have it?
Unanimous.
Minutes of prior meeting. We all got sent out the minutes of the meeting of September 20th. I wasn't there. You did splendidly without me. Do we have a motion?
I have some minor,
We knew we could
I
count
wasn't
it.
here,
We knew
can I
we could
recuse
count it.
myself? I'll be quick. Where was I? Oh, down just above subsection 2, the last paragraph there, the first section. The term is apprised, it says appraised in the text. Should drop the second A. And, on the back page, it's P.O. Lombardo. The notes here say Peter Lombardo, right? Correct, it's P.O.?
It is
P.O.
PO.
That's correct.
Yes.
And I think, yeah, I guess it was just those
P.O., yes.
Okay.
2 things. Although it's a little confusing in the groundwater mixing thing. It should be 2 to 3 feet vertically is where the transition occurs. Because you were talking aerial things, but that's what that means there, Matt, right? The
Yeah, mm-hmm.
2 to 3 feet, 2 to
Within a
3
meter
vertical
vertically,
feet, right,
yes.
okay.
Mhm.
we mentioned it to the previous note taker, and we'll mention it to this one, that this may be too much information for the kind of notes that we're supposed to be keeping. And we appreciate the thoroughness, but it's more work than needs to go into it. But anyway, moved and seconded.
Right,
Further discussion?
with those changes.
With those changes.
Yes,
Moved by
moved, so moved.
Tom, seconded by
I'll second it.
Virginia. The further discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
I'll abstain. Schedule for the next meeting.
Well, do you want my quick write-up on the stormwater management,
Yes.
which was item 4 on
Yes,
here?
Sorry.
yes, sorry.
It'll be
Right,
quick.
Right, report of members and staff, we whipped right over that.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I'll be quick, I promise. I know it's getting late.
that's all right.
So,
We're all paid by the hour.
So, last Wednesday, Jim McLaughlin, the town engineer, DPW engineer, presented the notice of intent and the plan to the Falmouth Conservation Commission. They were the last group that had to rule and decide on this proposal. I sat in on the meeting. Most of what you're going to see, it's going to be quick. I looked and snipped from his plans. But quick background, T-Ticket Path runs southeast from Route 28 or T-Ticket Highway in East Falmouth, and I guess maybe you can hear me if I stay over here and get in front of the figure. Several problems. One picture I presented last year. This is looking uphill. This is T-Ticket Highway or Route 28. Here, picture shot from right about here. The watershed over here to the west of the intersection is about halfway between Maravista Avenue Extended and T-Ticket Path, and on the other side it takes water from on beyond the intersection of Norris Path. So you've got that water coming off Route 28, going into catch basins, and then sent straight down T-Ticket Path. There's one catch basin here, and another one about here, and so you have all that water coming in. Some comes into Perch Pond through this ditch here. The water that's collected in this catch basin here comes out here through a culvert, through a head wall into Perch Pond. Also, Norris Path, which is this dirt, partly paved road. It's a private road that runs up through here and winds out to the northwest, sort of paralleling T-Ticket Path. There's no engineered storm water management. It's a private road there. Surface is very broken up. It's in really bad shape. So that flows in here, and with the exception of the small bit off of this west fork that goes to this catch basin, it becomes surface flow down on the T-Ticket Path here. Seabrook Drive is another private road. It does have an engineered storm drainage system, but it's in poor repair. Many of the basins are clogged. Some of the basins are above grade, so the water doesn't even get into the catch basin. So that water comes down this side. The high point over here, I don't know exactly, it's along in here somewhere. So that water flows this way. So all paths flow to T-Ticket Path in this case, and ultimately into Perch Pond, which I'm sure all of you are already aware is a little northwest extension off of Great Pond and has some of the highest nitrogen content of any situational. So that's the present conditions, and of course part of the major concern. And I'll work through Jim's plans here pretty quickly. The first 600 feet extending down to here is real standard classical storm drainage stuff. They're going to mill the road. While they have it milled, they're going to put in 4 1,000-gallon dry wells, represented up here in the very upper left-hand corner, in a 40 by 10 foot gravel bed to absorb things there. There'll be 3 more smaller ones here that are only 200-gallon ones. They're put in a 30 foot by 8 foot wide gravel bed, leach pit. Each of them installed with a weir that directs the first flow of water that comes downhill into these beds. So if there is overflow, it's later. And these systems right now are all engineered for the 25-year rainstorm. They're supposed to handle everything that there's a 4% chance per year of one of these major storms coming. So all of that is pretty standard, classic approach. It's just much greater volume, and they're going to do a better job of handling all this water. Interestingly enough, and if you remember our meeting with Jim last year, Virginia, the state doesn't offer any sort of help with this water that's coming off of their highway, which is part of it. It's not all of it. And then they're doing a similar thing down here with some smaller catch basin, bleach pits down there of 200-gallon capacity. So this section up here, 590 feet, and the section down here of 114 feet is just going to be milled and new pavement put down on top of that. But the interesting stuff is in the middle. They're going to change the profile of the road, and I apologize, it's way beyond my reach here. But you can see
They're going to raise the road.
they're going to raise the road. Well, they're going to lower it a little bit.
You have to use the mouse. Try using the mouse.
Yeah, I think it's the mouse that does the
They say
pointing.
that won't work.
Hmm?
If you just use the mouse to move the pointer, you look at the screen there. And
Oh, well, okay, good, yeah. I think that'll work better than
Yes.
this anyway. So, up here is the present road coming down to the intersection with Norris Path. They're going to plane that down. The new dark line here is the new profile. And then in this stretch here, now remember, the vertical dimension here is grossly exaggerated. They're gonna raise this about a foot. I've lost my mouth. They're gonna raise this about a foot so that the drainage from here is back what was uphill before into this grassy swale here, which you can see, which has a total of 3 catch basins around it. It's only 9 inches below grade, and the central catch basin is going to have a beehive grate on top of it. So sediment would settle out in the swale, and clean water would go in over the top. So they're redirecting the water, surface water from here, what was uphill before, back in here, and then down through this stretch, right beside the pond, they've put in this gravel trench, which is 38 feet long and 4 feet wide, and is filled with 3/4 to 1.5 inch stone, which I thought was a nice new approach. And that's going to capture the water coming from Seabrook Drive and that part down, and the remaining water from the high point on the new grade, which would be up here, is going to go back in there. So I'm really pleased with what they did, particularly when they consider everything they did within the existing 40-foot road layout.
Yes.
There's no property takings or anything else. They've gotten all this done within this 40-foot corridor.
And they've dealt with 2 private roads that come in that create a lot of problems, but because they're private roads, they couldn't get at them. So
Right.
this is quite
Yeah.
creative.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that they can't do any improvements on the private
Norris
roads
or Seabrook.
right now, so that limited what they could do too. So I was very pleased with the whole approach. It was very well thought out, and they're putting lots of water underground that was running on the surface before and into Perch Pond. Eric?
Could you go back to your previous slide?
The previous slide, yes, let's see here. This one?
No, one more, the picture.
One more. The big picture?
Yeah, big picture. One more.
The colored one.
Oh, the color, oh,
The
I'm
aerial
sorry.
photo.
The locust
Yeah.
shot, yes.
Okay, that green strip in the middle there
Yeah,
is a stream that starts at the state highway and contains a lot of state highway runoff and brings it down straight into Perch Pond.
right.
I assume a lot is coming in via that, and are they doing anything about that?
Well, that's what's happening with these new systems. They're using the existing 18-inch drainage pipe
Yeah,
that is there, but they're putting a weir
okay.
on the pipe that captures the first flush of water
Okay.
and sends it into these
No, Eric,
basins.
No,
Eric is talking about, can you use the cursor on this one?
Yeah.
All right, I'm
the
gonna direct you
psychedelic
to
green,
it.
the psychedelic
Psychedelic
green,
green.
No,
that's,
no, it's the darker green. Go
No.
up to the right.
Psychedelic green.
it's a valley.
Go up.
Here?
There, yes.
All of
All the
that.
way up there.
Yeah, that's, nothing's being done with that now. That's a wooded wetland salt marsh down at this reach.
Yeah, I'm not sure the state's.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood what you were
It's a-
saying. No, they're,
It's a major stream that brings the water into the pond, I believe.
Yeah, but I think it's largely groundwater. I have walked in there, and.
I didn't go back in there at all
It
last year.
it's very wooded. As you move farther up, you get to the commercial developments, and there are parking lots. I'm sure those parking lots are benefiting from this.
Right.
But I do not believe there's state water coming.
The head of this is right behind Obashan Hardware,
Oh,
Yeah.
and that
I know
reach in there, and
Okay.
in front of
You
the
think there's a
Woodsmith.
pipe?
I think some of that comes from state road runoff.
Oh, I think some of it probably does up there, but it has,
Has to come through Obashan's parking lot.
yeah, and
They put-
farther up where the On the Water shop is, and Falmouth Motor Car, and that stretch there.
Boy, I know.
I'm sure some water comes in up
I
there.
know exactly where it is, but I do have a sense that there are state collection pipes at that point
Yeah,
which directed that flow into that water stream
yes.
and bring it into Perch Pond.
And they're doing the same thing at the head of Great Pond, right beside 28, where the Coonamessett River comes in. Those catch basins right in front of Falmouth Port. Because last year when I went out there, I went in and photographed those spots too. It's the same thing, they just have a head wall with a culvert, usually a 36-inch culvert in it. They go into basins.
Yeah.
But I have no idea how they're maintained. And I assume something like that might be happening up there too, although I'm not aware of that particular spot.
It'd be quite interesting to know what the nitrogen concentration is coming from, at the base of that little valley.
That little stream,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, because if you go back and look at this, because my gut feeling is the stormwater doesn't account for a lot of nitrogen.
Well, that
It's
is-
really in the groundwater. But if you look at that spike in the very top of Perch Pond, the very northern
Yes.
extremes, and you wonder, where's that coming from?
Mm.
So-
You take a cup of water from the stream and call it an oyster and put it in that other grant?
But anyway, given,
Anyway.
as I said, I thought that Jim and his crew did a really good job, given the limitations and what they had to work with.
Yes.
Plus, by raising the road a foot, gonna reduce, I've been down there on ordinary high tide, and it looked like it was coming right up in the road.
No question, it
Yeah.
does,
Yeah.
It does.
really.
I've just a quick question. Driving down there, somebody has a sign out in his yard, right? Beside Route 28 or in that area. It
It's
says,
before you get,
shows that the road will come up to,
Right.
like basically up to his front door practically, you know?
Yeah.
It's like half of the front yard is gonna be
Right.
taken. Is that in that 40-foot?
That layout is probably an 80-foot. If it's a county road, at least, and I can't speak for all of the things.
I'm just
but-
saying on Route 28.
Right, I know where you're talking
Yeah,
about.
I don't know, but it looks pretty,
that's a separate issue, but it's gonna
Yeah.
have its own hearing next week.
it is.
Yeah.
Specifically at the Herman Room.
It's a very big deal in that stretch right now.
His
you
concern is
suggesting
not
that
this, it's the road widening for the.
Okay. So not this, is that related to this?
Right.
Well, the present plan is for sidewalks and I think maybe even bike lanes.
Bike lines, sidewalks, the works, yeah.
So it's gonna be really wide.
Yeah, the
But,
neighbors.
but this, what I think Ron is saying is, if you're gonna widen it, besides putting bike lanes and sidewalks, you can put stuff underneath them
Right,
that look like French drains.
right, and I don't know what the plans are for that, but I would sure like to see it because,
When's
you know,
that
from this
hearing?
photograph here, you can see, you know,
Right, yes,
if it comes off the pavement up there, there's one, right now, there's one catch basin up here, a small one.
there's a hearing on the 24th on that road and widening project that may, Might
I'll
include-
send you
include
the,
some of this.
I think it's the 24th.
Yeah.
I'll send you all the notice.
Which committee, is it a public meeting or?
DPW is sponsoring it.
Yes, because there's been such a public outcry, the T-Ticket Civic Association and just general residents have mobilized, and so the state has been invited to come to this meeting, and I believe it's going to be run by the DPW.
Does it go by Mill Pond? That
Not that
section?
No,
Doesn't go
no,
that far?
it stops at the Coonamessett.
Oh, okay.
This particular section of, it goes from the Coonamessett to Davis Straits, where Falmouth Heights Road comes in.
This is great.
Thank you.
You know, as you say, it's not something that gets you a big bang in terms of nitrogen at the end, but it's something we can do now, which is important.
And it's incremental, you know,
Exactly.
because every gallon.
Especially in that place.
Yes.
That pond.
It's a lot faster than what Long Island is doing.
Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah, I was shocked.
I think another thing too, we look at averages, but the runoff, you know, when we have big rains in early spring,
Yeah.
when it's going right into the pond, it's
Yep.
bringing extra stuff in, and
Sure.
probably the algae bloom had something to do with that. So this is a really great thing.
Yes, thank you for
All right.
following up on it. All right, any other reports of members and staff, since I breezed right over that? No? Okay, if not, discussion of the schedule for the next meetings. Customarily, we'd be the first and third Thursday, which is the 1st and the 15th. Is that very good or very bad?
Sounds good.
Or all right? Okay, well, we don't have to vote that, I think. We'll just,
That's 3:30?
At 3:30.
yeah, 3:30.
We
Sailing
could add
season
that
seems to be over. All right, Matt, you got a motion for me?
I do. Motion to adjourn.
Can I second that?
You can.
All right, I
Moved and
rushed through that,
seconded.
but I got it
Discussion, all in
happened.
favy?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. We are adjourned.